Let the earth support you. I was once checking into a hotel. I was in the elevator, holding my very heavy suitcase in my arms, when I had the realization, put it down. The elevator will carry you, and it as well. So let the earth support you. Feel that. Feel space touching you. Often we hear a phrase like touching space, and it's a very active thought, like taking our finger and poking it in the air. But space is already touching us, it's always touching us. We just have to receive it, we have to feel it. And in that same mode, see if you can feel the in and out breath wherever it's most graphic, most clear for you, nostrils, chest, or abdomen. You don't have to try to make your breath deeper or different. Just however it's appearing, we'll receive it, we'll experience it. It's a quality of rest, of just being with. And if you find your attention wandering, you get lost in thought, spun out in a fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. You can recognize that, see if you can let go gently, and just bring your attention back to the feeling of the breath. No matter how many times you have to let go and begin again, it's totally fine. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Dan, for being with us today. Lizette gave you a beautiful introduction, and I just want to say that I echo her words wholeheartedly. You and I met just a few years ago at Santa Cruz, and I too felt that sense of embodiment, which for me is always the test of a person's words and thoughts and the theories and practices. Is it embodied? And I certainly found it that way in you. And then after we met, through a talk you gave that I watched online, I learned a story from your 20s that involves your body and considerable damage to it, and began to realize how this accident you had, which could have taken your life, I think, when you were in your early 20s, in some ways was a finger pointing to your destiny and the work that you do. I'd love for you to tell that story. And as you tell it, I would invite everybody listening to it to pay attention not only to the particulars, but to the sort of dynamics of the story, and ask yourself as a listener, has anything of this general nature ever happened to me? So welcome, Dan, and let's begin with a story.
Thank you, Parker. And it's an honor to be here with all of you. And it's really a genuine privilege for me to be invited to join you here. It's great to be here with Sharon and Lizette. Great to see you again. And Aaron, really pleasure. So the story that we'll begin with, that I hope will weave with your own stories as Parker is inviting you to reflect on, is just one person's experience that, if there's something in it that's inviting you then to reflect more on your own life, that'd be wonderful. So this story, begins right before I turned 20, actually. I was a biochemistry college student, but I took an anthropology course on film ethnography, studying different cultures through film. And my professor asked me if I wanted to spend the summer in Mexico. And I know some of you are from Mexico, I see on the chat. And so this was south of Mexico City, near La Presa Miguel Alemán, the dam that had been built, named after the former president. And they were going to expand the dam. And so the issue was, how is modernization going to impact the communities that were there in the villages near the dam, because they now would have to move. So I went with a team of people from the United Nations. We were working as a part of the division of the World Health Organization. And since I was on my way I was applying to medical school at the time, they put me on a team to study curanderos. And so I was studying the local folk healers in this small little village outside of a larger town called Tuxtepec, just sort of in the mountains between the East Coast, which is the Gulf of Mexico, and the West Coast, which is the Pacific Ocean. And it was in the state of Veracruz, for those of you who know Mexico. So part of that was interviewing the local healers, but another part was we were going to interview the queen of the mushrooms, La Reina de los Hongos, and she was, someone who was most expert in psilocybin. This was in I guess this would have been the 1977. And so I myself had family members who were severely addicted to drugs. So I had developed a psychological aversion to any kind of substance that would alter my mental state. So I was just fascinated to learn from her about what these mushrooms were doing. Anyway, so the morning of traveling, the night before, we had some very painful communication with the people from the Zapotec and Chinantec tribes that were there. We were all hanging out and having dinner, and some were drinking more than others, but they were saying they were angry at us being from the United Nations and not bringing medicines. We were just taking information because we were studying, how the dam expansion would change the folk healing and things like that. So they were really upset, and it really was agitating for my colleague and myself. And so we didn't get that great a sleep. And then around 4 a.m, the band came in the local village to set up the market for all the farms coming into the town. So we woke up very early, and so we weren't well rested. But I remember going to the horse ranch to get our horses to go see the queen of the mushrooms. And so we got on the horses. I knew how to ride a horse, and so did my colleagues and the young boy who was living with us. And as we were riding, all I can tell you is that we were going at a full gallop. We were now going up the hill to go up into the mountains. And the next thing I know, I was in a hospital, the local clinic, and I had the horse's saddle had gotten loose, and so the saddle had turned to the belly of this young pony, and as it was going at a full gallop now with this rider underneath it, it went even faster, and my feet stayed in the stirrups. So my arm was hurt, and I lost my teeth. I broke my nose, and my colleagues, my colleague and the boy we're living with, they told me later that they thought I was dead. Because I had been dragged so long. And then when I was moaning, they thought I must have broken my neck. But, fortunately, amazingly, I didn't die and I didn't break my neck. So while the injuries were pretty severe, physically, the biggest thing that happened was I lost any sense of a personal identity. I no longer knew that I had a name like Dan. And, when this was happening, I said to myself, I could feel things, I could be aware of things, but I kept on, for some reason, I would say to my colleague and this young boy, who am I? Who am I? And I would just repeat that. And yet, even though I had all these injuries, I was really kind of full of this electric feeling of being alive, very filled with joy. I remember when they tried to bring stuff in this round object, I guess now we would call it a plate, it had these colors that were like dancing off the plate, and I would just like laugh, and, I would lift up this thing that now we would call a glass, and in would pour this kind of stuff that would go into this opening, and it was just, nothing had a name, and it was like being awake with this profound sense of gratitude for every moment's new kind of unfolding. And so I was actually pretty happy and very present, and it was I think everyone was worried because I had no teeth, I had this broken nose, my arm was broken. And yet I was kind of like in this, I remember this part about being just there, just present, And so over the 24 hours, it was this slow emergence when they kept on telling me my name that I started remembering things. I started remembering, that I had a name, where the history of this body had been from, that, I was in the middle of applying to medical school. I had a girlfriend who was waiting to see where I would go to school because she was on the East Coast, and, all these things. And it was like, by 24 hours, the name came back, the identity came back. But what didn't come back was this taking for granted that the name Dan had a concrete reality to it. But instead, and I turned 20 just about a few days later, it was like a 20th, birthday present, that I thought it was funny when I, instead of getting gold teeth in Mexico, I decided to get white teeth in the United States. And I remember when I was in the border going back, and I had very long hair, and so I'm sure the border people thought I was bringing in drugs or something. So they checked all my bags and they frisked me and everything like that. And I was looking down, my hair over my eyes, and they said, "Are you bringing anything into the country, kid?" And I looked up and gave them this big, toothless smile. And I said, "No, but I'm leaving something there," and they said, "Oh my God, just go in." And when I went back to the United States and they were fixing everything up, I would just laugh inside of me when people would call me Dan, because I thought they didn't understand that our personal identity is a construction. So that sort of stayed with me and alleviated, I think, my adolescent angst about dying and all sorts of things in a kind of a way that I thought was either from a head injury, brain damage, or some kind of existential shift, or maybe it was a near-death experience or something. So I never really thought about it. And then just the end of the story is that I guess I was 20 then. It must have been about 30 years later, something like that, maybe a little less, 25 years later, the first time I would ever really talk to anyone about it. I was invited to do a conference with Jack Kornfield and Houston Smith, and on spirituality, which I had no background in, and mindfulness, which I had no background in. And so Jack Kornfield took me to lunch. And so we're talking and talking, not about the horse accident, but just about, things or whatever. And he looks at me and he goes, "You know about this mindfulness stuff?" I go, "No, I don't know anything about the mindfulness stuff. I don't meditate. I don't." He goes, No, you know about, how do you know about this? How'd you learn about this? So for some reason, for the first time ever, I talked to another human being about the horse accident.
Mm.
And he had to go somewhere and I had to go somewhere. So we separated. And I was busy typing out a manuscript, and the phone rings and it's Jack, and he goes, "I can't stop thinking about what you said about that horse accident." And I said, why can't you stop talking about it? He goes, "Don't you understand? People will meditate for decades to get what you got by accident." And I would say, why would someone want to break their nose and lose their teeth and almost die by meditating? He laughs and laughs because you have no idea what I'm saying. I said, "It's not only that I don't have an idea of what you're saying. What you're saying to me makes no sense. It's illogical." And he goes, "Well," and he's laughing. And I said, "But there's something strange. Since you're the first person I've ever shared this with," I told him, "I actually feel a kind of relief that there's something there. But why would someone want to have this?" He goes, "They'd want to get rid of their personal identity." And I said to him, "I don't know why someone would want to do that." And he laughed and laughed, but then he just said, "Welcome to the family." And that started a whole, friendship and professional teaching together, where now I understand, and we can talk about it, very recently, actually, the last 15 years or so, the notion of personal identity, and, that it's not just something that's a personal trap, but actually maybe a global problem when people think the self is separate. And just yesterday morning, I finished, the manuscript for my next book, which is all about this whole issue of identity and belonging. And, for the first time, I gave a detailed accounting in a writing of this horse accident. And, I was inspired when Sharon and Parker said, "Hey, why don't you talk about the horse accident?" I go, "What?" And I just written about it in the book. So I'm happy to share it with you here. And I hope there's something in the story that serves some benefit to, more than being amusing and, kind of a funny overview, but something we can use to talk about this important issue of, what personal identity is, why there's a problem with it at all, and why it's important to question it and then try to liberate ourselves from its hold on us as a humanity.
Well, thank you, Dan. And that, of course, is the invitation I want to extend to the group for a few minutes. Have you ever had an experience in which you came to some, maybe I hope, less painful awareness that personal identity can be a construct, and that the nature of that construct can separate you from others, from the whole, from nature itself, from your own life in the world? And if you have, this would be a good time, I think, in the wake of Dan's powerful story, which resonates in so many ways with me, even though I've never had such an accident, to make a few notes about that, have a chance to meditate on them as this conversation goes on, and actually bring them to the cafe that's going to happen later this month, which Aaron will say a few words about later. So before we invite Dan to continue telling about his work, let me just give you that few minutes to reflect and make some notes, okay? Well, before I pass it back to Sharon, I'll just say, to maybe personalize my note of appreciation, Dan, is that story has helped me understand in part the impact of several deep dives into clinical depression that have been part of my life, what happened to my sense of self in the wake of those. And it also helped me understand a moment in the high desert of New Mexico where I suddenly apprehended, out there, out of sight of any human being or human construct, I suddenly apprehended that the cosmos was utterly indifferent to me, and at one and the same time, utterly accepting and forgiving of me. And it was so interesting that that moment in which I felt fully integrated into the whole and really lost my sense of a separate self was also a moment of acceptance and forgiveness, which I didn't even know I needed. So thank you for the story. Those are a couple of my own personal analogs. Sharon, let me pass it to you.
Thank you. I'm somebody put in the chat, Dan, I guess you didn't need the mushrooms, which was kind of a perfect comment. I just wanted to highlight that. And I love your work and the way that you are emphasizing questions of identity and that sense of self, and especially using the phrase, it's a construct. Because, I remember, say, going to India when I was very young in order to learn how to meditate, and there was a certain flavor to, not within Buddhist teaching, but different spiritual things I had read about, where the idea was that we're going to kill the ego, we're going to annihilate it, we're going to destroy something. And that was terrifying to me, like almost like I had a companion that I had had all along, and that I was about to jettison it and destroy it. And it was only later that, with a more sophisticated understanding, I realized that another way of presenting that is the idea that we are often suffering from some kind of confusion about the nature of the self. And it's the confusion, the ignorance, the myths we have absorbed and tend to believe. That's the problem. And so we're not trying to kill anything or annihilate anything. We're trying to understand how things are. And for those of you who appreciate my cups, this one says, banging your head against the wall is never fun, which is a saying I apparently use a lot. People send me cups with things I say a lot. And that has to do with just this. When we live in defiance of how things are, when we're at some odd angle to the truth of things, we suffer, and we cause a lot of suffering as well. So it's an incredible area to explore. And I realize as part of my exploration is actually language, because we say, this part of myself believes this, or this part of myself is moved by that. And I'm not sure part, although it's the word I use, it's the word we tend to use in English just out of convention. I began thinking, well, maybe that's a little too solid, that they're really narratives in some way. They're narratives with biological components, so that it's not, again, that sense of solidity, like it's something I've got to get rid of, it's something I have to vanquish. That part of myself is terrible. We can change that whole framework and see it as a path of more fluidity. There's more changeability, there's more movement. And the goal is really to integrate, to be able to hold everything in some kind of understanding. So what do you have to say?
Well, that's beautiful, Sharon and Parker. Thank you. In the meditation, Sharon, that, the first time I ever formally meditated was under your guidance at the center that you started in Barre, Massachusetts. And so I want to mention the experience there a bit, but first to just address, Parker, your sharing of being depressed and how that altered state in a mood condition, can really shift the experience of self, and as can meditation. So I think maybe for just a couple of minutes, I'll offer you just a kind of framing that maybe can build on the community work that Parker so beautifully has brought to the world, and Sharon's fantastic work about meditation broadly, but especially about loving kindness. And one time Sharon and I were teaching together, and I said to you, Sharon, what do you mean by this phrase, loving kindness? What does that really mean? And you said, well, it really means realizing the reality of our interconnected nature. So we'll talk about what connection might mean. And in depression, of course, one of the huge feelings is disconnection. And so the comments I'll make come from a pursuit that's a little different from community work and a little different from meditation, but they resonate with those works in something I think E.O. Wilson, the sociobiologist, might call consilience, which is, how you find independent pursuits, find a common ground. So my background, as I mentioned, was in biochemistry, and then I went to medicine, and then pediatrics, and then psychiatry, and then adult and adolescent psychiatry. Then I became a researcher in something called attachment research, which was studying parent-child relationships at a time when the decade of the brain was like the hot thing. It was the 1990s. And so everyone was saying, oh, the mind is just the brain, which had been said since William James's time, the grandfather of modern psychology in 1890. But Hippocrates had said it 2,500 years earlier. So the grandfather of modern medicine sort of said, mind is what brain does, essentially. So that view, which was the pervasive science view, really didn't feel right in this body. It just felt wrong, but everyone was saying it. So I thought, they must be correct, I suppose. But that started a search for me to see, what the connections are among three things: the brain in your body, your mind, meaning your thoughts and feelings and consciousness and memories and stuff like that, your subjective experience, and relationships with people, and, as Parker is inviting us to recall, with the planet, with the cosmos. So what is the connection among, just to put it really simply, relationships, mind, and brain? And, so I invited, because I was a scientist, a bunch of scientists, 40 scientists together to look at that question from all sorts of fields: mathematics, physics, all the way to sociology and linguistics and anthropology. And what was fascinating was there was no agreement on what the mind was. No one had a definition of the mind. Everyone could agree the brain is up in your head and it does fascinating things. But the mind, no one had a definition. So it's a long story that I'm not going to get into here, but the bottom line is, if you used the skull as an impermeable boundary to locate mind, you came up with one way of approaching it scientifically, which has been pervading our view for the last 2,500 years. Yet if you expand it even a bit to include the skin encased body, you get a little more action going there. So we'll use the phrase embodied brain, but actually you stay limited. So then you go, well, what in the world would go beyond the skull or go beyond the skin that could invite us to consider what the mind might be? And then you get into something that takes a while to unpack, but it's the fundamental stuff of the universe, which is called energy. And energy sometimes is pure energy, like if I go blah, 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 or sometimes it's information, like if I say good morning or versus good evening. It's energy flow in the sense of, sound, movement of air molecules, but they have different meanings. So energy and information changes, and we call that flow. So if you look at the fundamental stuff of mind as energy and information flow, you realize it isn't limited by skull or skin. So then if we go to the question that all of you may be contending with, like, why are you here on Earth? You were born into a body. You get about, if we're fortunate, about 100 years to live in the body. Why are you here? Now, for all of you here, you're realizing being of service to the world is what gives you a sense of purpose and meaning, and the world benefits from all the incredible work that you're all doing. That's not true of everyone, but that's true for you here on the screen. It comes with challenges. So we want to make sure you're feeling resilient, you're feeling connected, you have this way of thriving in the face of the challenges that we as humanity are not only facing, but we're actually creating. And so when you look at, let's say, 4 of the pandemics we face, not just the viral pandemic and how we cooperate for the greater good, but the pandemic of social injustice and racism, right? And pandemic just means something that's found throughout humanity, right? The pandemic of environmental destruction, a 3rd pandemic, the pandemic of misinformation and polarization. And what I'll have you consider is that those 4 pandemics are either worsened by or maybe even caused by a 5th pandemic, which I think contemplative practices, contemplative wisdom is taught for a long time, but in science, we never even talk about, which is, or in clinical work, the pandemic of, let's just name it, the solo self, the idea that your personal identity is the totality of who you are. Now, you may not feel it because you're in service of the greater good, but for much of modernity, if you look at the study, anthropological studies, we're pushing towards a separate, isolated, solo self that fits perfectly with the idea that the mind just comes from the brain. And if the mind creates the self, then of course, who you are is just inside your head, or if you want to get a little bit broader, inside your skin encased body. So what I want to just summarize this view, this dive into identity and belonging, is with a simple acronym that I hope is helpful, but it's the acronym SPA, S-P-A. If you look at a lot of the different research studies or even philosophical discussions or even contemplative discussions about self, SPA helps us locate what people often mean by self. It has, the S is a subjective sense to it. The P is a perspective to it, like from what angle are you seeing things. The A is agency, a sense of action. So if we put the spa of that selfing experience inside your skin encased body, it's natural to then say, you know, I'm Parker, I'm Sharon, I'm Lizette, I'm Aaron, I'm just this body. Yet we now know, just to go into the brain just a teeny bit, that there is a mapping of that view of self in the body that is in the midline set of areas. And because when you put a person in a scanner, it's kind of activated when you're not giving them a task to do. So it's that, in English, we use the phrase default. It's where you go when you have nothing else to do, like your default thing. So the default mode network, the DMN, is, if you had to get specific in terms of brain areas, it's this midline set of areas that seem to be what have a correlation. The activity of the DMN, the default mode network, correlates with the experience when it's excessively activated of a separate self. It's where you say, I'm Sharon, I'm Parker, right? I'm Lizette. This is where your name is. Interestingly, the side areas, unlike these midline, things that are concerned with others and the self. So I call it the OAT circuit. What are others thinking of me? What do I think of others thinking of me? What do I think of others thinking of me, thinking of them? It's like social media going wild is a default mode, addiction. The side areas of your brain and your head mediate sensation. So when Sharon invites us to just sense the breath, or even sensing your heart, those are all side areas of the brain, left and right. Now, what's interesting about it is these are mutually inhibitory. So if you do a meditation, you can show, if you teach a person to know how to focus attention, which is what drives energy and information flow, into awareness, which is a whole thing we can talk about, you are then activating side sensory circuits and forcing your default mode to calm down, to chill out, to quiet down. Probably what happened in my horse accident was, my head hit so much, my default mode was like knocked out, but my sensory areas were fine. So, and I didn't have the linguistic centers probably working, so I couldn't name anything. So I had beginner's mind, and I was just full of joy. And love and kind of incredible gratitude, because I wasn't like unconscious. I was very conscious, maybe even more conscious, because I wasn't being filtered by, what are called top-down filters of prior experience limiting my awareness of things. So in a way, the top-down construction of a separate self is both mediated inside of the body for all sorts of reasons we could talk about, but also because of our evolutionary history making in-group, out-group distinctions. And this is the exact area of the brain that says, oh, are you like me or not like me? And if you're like me, I'll treat you with empathy and compassion and kindness, and you're in my kin. But if I evaluate you for whatever reason as not like me, I will literally shut off these empathy circuits. So the default mode isn't bad. It's where we have empathy and insight and compassion. So it's not like it's a bad guy. When it's overly active, you get depressed and you get anxious and you get incredibly self-preoccupied. So we want to integrate it, as Sharon is saying, we want to integrate it with the whole system. And in that way, if you take the spa thing, this is what I'll finish with. It's you have the capacity, or we all have the capacity, to develop what we can just call an identity lens. So you say, I have a body. So one aspect, integration means differentiating and linking. One differentiated aspect of self-experience is in this body. And someone gave it a name, Sharon. So, okay, this is Sharon. I get about 100 years to live in this manifestation. Fine. But if I think that's all myself is, then I'm going to be not integrated, because there are other differentiated selves. I am my relationships with my close friends and family. I'm my relationships with a broader circle of friends. I'm my relationships with my neighbors, my colleagues. I'm in a broad relationship with all people who live in my state, my country. I'm in a broad relationship with all of humanity. And then you go, not only do I have a subjective sense of that and a perspective of that and an agency on behalf of that, but I can go beyond humanity, which we have to do to deal with the pandemic of environmental destruction, and realize I am nature. And I need to sense nature and be in nature, have the perspective of nature, and to act on behalf of nature. So I think we're in this moment with the viral pandemic of realizing the incredible suffering created by the disintegrated states of racism and social injustice, of the polarization and misinformation, of the way in which the environment is being destroyed, all of which are made worse, if not caused by this non-integrated view of self, which modern culture keeps on teaching us. See, that's the thing. The relationships within our families and schools and society keep on telling us that they told me I'm just Dan. And guess what? I believed them until the horse accident told my default mode to calm down, or believe it or not, meditation that works calms the default mode network down, or the mechanism for psilocybin, for those mushrooms, is it calms the default mode network down. I mean, now we know this in the last 18 months. So it all kind of is coming together, that an excessively activated default mode self-preoccupation, solo self view is killing us individually, in families, in communities, and on the planet. So then you say, well, then what are we to do? I think what we need to do is bring the contemplative wisdom insights, combine them with these modern science perspectives for community activation, and do exactly what you're doing. Only now we have all of us working together, right? This isn't like, let's take a little here, a little there, a little there. We have this moment where we can say, who you are. We can say to a kindergarten kid or a 10th grader, who you are is more than your body. Yes, your body is important. Sleep your body well, exercise your body, feed your body, stretch your body. That's your inner self. But you equally have a relational self that's connected to people on the planet. You are all those selves, subjective experience, perspective, and agency. So have a party, enjoy it. And together, let's try to bring more integration into the world. You're not just a me, you're also a we, and you're both. So then you say, I'm a me plus a we, and you get this fun term we. So we're trying to collect the term we in all the different languages on the planet, so that together as a human family, we could say, okay, enough with this violation to truth. who you are is not just your body. And here's the contemplative wisdom backing that up, indigenous teaching backing that up. Here's the community practice backing that up. And here is the science that is joining the party to finally get on board and say, it's as if, and this is the last acronym I'll give you, it's as if, in this practice I do called the Wheel of Awareness, where people have never meditated before in their lives, or they can be long-term meditators, they get in the hub of the wheel of pure awareness and they experience three things amazingly all around the planet: connection in the hub, open awareness, and love. And that's a different use of the acronym COLD, and I've used it before, but I realized finishing this chapter a few days ago that connection, openness, and love are like three threads of a singular tapestry of life. And so in a way, what our journey is to release this coal of connection, open awareness, and love. We don't have to make it happen. We need to liberate people from the lie of the separate self that gets in the way. And then together, we can make this a kinder, more compassionate world and move forward, really dealing directly with the root causes of these forms of suffering. So thank you so much. I hope that made sense. And it's an honor to share some of these experiences with you.
Thank you. I think it made a lot of sense. I think the invitation is for both and. It's recognizing in a way our individuality and the appreciation of our gifts, and the recognition of our sorrows at the same time in a broader context. Because without that broader context, it's so lonely and misguided. We so misunderstand, I think, the nature of how we can be happy, how we can fulfill that desire to serve, so many things. And I'm really struck, especially with the term relationship, because that's how I see meditation, or that's how I see mindfulness. It is that growth of awareness and loving kindness toward ourselves. And so that in a way is almost like a moment to moment reflection of how that integration happens, I think, because it's interesting, one of my teachers, is Tibetan teacher, Sakya Rinpoche. He said, it's not the thoughts and the feelings that are the problem, it's the glue. It's that sense of this is who I am, this is the sum total of who I am, or the kind of revulsion at what we're feeling. So all the shame and fear that we may add on top of what's already maybe difficult to bear, and the ways in which we are distanced so that we don't recognize even what we're feeling, which is another kind of holding in its own way. And so developing a different relationship to, you could say, the joys and the sorrows as they appear within as well as without seems really key. And I wonder, Parker, actually, if you would like to say something about that, especially given, as you describe those times of depression and difficulty.
Well, Dan is absolutely right when he said depression is the ultimate experience of isolation, of separation, where it's almost impossible to feel connected to another human being. And if you're fortunate enough, and I think it is sheer luck often, to emerge from that, not only survive it, but thrive after it, in the wake of it, you then realize more deeply how profoundly important connection is in your life. And you seek ways to amplify it, and first in your own awareness, and then, as you said, Dan, in practical action, in forms of agency that create community, or, as I have kind of like to say from the beginning of my work, we don't really create community, we allow it into our consciousness and into our lives. It's there as gift. It's not something that we achieve, it's something we receive in its most profound ways. I mean, I think the clearest personal example is love. I don't go around creating love, but love is out there. And if I can receive it and pass it along, then I guess we have something related to the happiness that American culture seems to find so elusive. And I know lots of us, myself included, challenge the notion that happiness is the ultimate goal. Wholeness maybe, but wholeness is also about embracing your brokenness. And I want to ask, I want to pose it in the form of a question has been vexing me during the last year and a half, maybe 5 years really. And that is, there have been so many episodes in my 82 years that have demonstrated the profound interdependence in which we live with the human and non-human world of nature. I keep wondering, why are we so slow? Why am I so slow? But why are we collectively so slow to get the message? When over the years, time and time again, it has been shown to be so, that what happens to all of us happens to each of us. You know, that no man or woman is an island. It's ancient wisdom in many ways. And it's one of the things that's come to me in the last 18 months, when that interdependence, that the largeness of the community that we actually inhabit in a very practical way, has been so self-evident, you know, so self-evident that we walk around, if we're wise, with masks on to be good members of that community. And we listen to people who are saying, don't take away my freedom, with an appalled mind. Like, where do they think they live? Do they not care about me? I've wondered why the message hasn't gotten through more clearly. And of course, I understand all the answers that have to do with the politicization of COVID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's a wondering. Is there, and I wonder if your research sheds any light on this, is there any relationship between the fact that the collective holds so much suffering, the natural world and the human world, so much suffering, that we just can't embrace it as the reality in which we live, because it would invite us to hold more than I'm capable of holding? I feel it this very day in relation to what's going on in Minnesota, the state where I went to college, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a barrier here, or do we misunderstand what it means to hold the suffering of the whole?
Sharon, do you want to take a first?
No, I was waiting for you to take a first step and all.
Okay. It's a really powerful question. And there are two initial layers of responses, Parker, are one is, yes, I mean, if you open your heart to, you know, feel a resonance with the suffering, and that resonance turns into identification where it becomes you, in all of you, you'll burn out. I mean, the studies are, in terms of you're asking about the research, the studies are really clear. I mean, I can give you just a simple research paradigm that kind of clarified this. They put a person in a scanner, you know, to study their brain, for example, and they showed them a photograph of something terrible. It was a terrible car accident. And the one set of subjects were told, imagine what this would feel like if this happened to you. You know, a simple question, right? The brains of those individuals that were given that question got extremely activated. They could imagine themselves in this horrible, disfiguring, maybe even, you know, near lethal car accident. And they were just overwhelmed. The whole brain shut down. Initially, the circuits of empathy and compassion were activated so they could feel into what was going on, and just shut off. But if the other set of subjects, that had a very different reaction, they were told, Imagine what it feels like to be that person in that car accident. So not losing differentiation, maintaining that this is this body, that's that body. Their circuits of compassion were activated and their brain stayed in equilibrium. So this term integration combines differentiation on the one hand and linkage on the other. So we want to stay integrated, not overly identify. So this becomes a tool of resilience. If we're going to go out and try to work in a world of suffering, we need to maintain differentiation. When I first taught this to a young therapist who was the daughter of a friend of mine, she was burning out. And we went through it's a long story, but the short version is when I clarified for her that being empathic doesn't mean identifying as the other person. It means integrating so that you stay differentiated so you can actually help them. Imagine a parent who comes up to a kid who's fallen and has this big scrape on their knee. If the parent falls down crying, clutching her own knee, that's not going to help the kid. So differentiation important. That's the first layer. The second thing I'll just say about compassion for the larger whole. This has a couple of threads to it, so I'll just name them briefly, and if we want to talk more about them in depth, we can do that. But the first to say is that for 50 million years in our primate evolution, we've done this thing called in-group, out-group distinction. And it has some pretty important survival issues for our primate heritage. We survived because we said, who's my kin? And if you're not my kin, I keep you away. And then when we developed humanity out of our primate heritage, that's 50 million years of primate history. But then in the last, 100, 200,000 years as human beings, we've extended that in-group, out-group distinction in, unfortunately, hugely structured ways of genocide, so that we as a species will say, if you're in my in-group, I'm going to be collaborative with you, compassionate, kind. We're going to have great creativity together. But if you're in my out-group, I'm going to literally, when we put people in brain scanners to show this, I'm going to shut off my circuitry of empathy and compassion. And when I look at you, once I've put you in my out-group, especially if there's threat, I'm going to see you as a piece of dirt and I'll brush you aside. And if I need to, I will build, as has happened all over this planet, systematic ways of killing you. Just like the Nazis before the Holocaust came to the United States to study how the United States government could so systematically dehumanize, marginalize, and kill Black people. And they used the United States as their prototype of how to destroy Jews in Europe. And if you just read the book Caste, and you'll see this all documented by the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson. The issue there is that, for us as humans in these incarnations, in these bodies, we have this genetically determined in-group, out-group process where if we say someone's in the out-group, we don't see them in a compassionate way. So the two other little points I'll just say is that in developmental psychology, you can study kids as young as 14 months of age, and they will ask the same question, who's like me, not like me, even like who likes the cereal I like. I'll treat that puppet, in this case, nicely. If there's a puppet that likes a cereal I don't like, I'm going to hit him. So, that's probably not taught. It's probably a genetic legacy we have from 50 million years, refined into our human incarnation. And so when I asked His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, one time, I was given the opportunity to teach with Andy Meltzoff, who's a developmentalist, and Alicia Lieberman and Richie Davidson and myself. We were on stage with the Dalai Lama. And he turns to us and he says, we in religion, whether it's theistic or non-theistic religion, we haven't done a good job of making this world more compassionate. We just haven't. And he laughs his laugh, and he goes, so, and he points to the four of us, he goes, so it's up to you to come up with a scientific way we can make this world more compassionate. And this is in Seattle. So I thought about it. And then about 12 months later, I happened to be on the stage with him again to give him my homework assignment in Vancouver, Canada, in British Columbia. And so I said to him, I said, if integration is the basis of health and people have a birthright to have health, integration is also made visible kindness and compassion. So we need to promote more integration. And building on what he had said in Seattle, though, he very powerfully pointed out there's two kinds of compassion. There's one that's limited and biased, which let's just call it near compassion for your family and friends. And that you can feel the wholeheartedness of, being there for someone really suffering with them. And it can be really intense, but not overwhelming. The other kind of compassion that His Holiness talked about, he called unlimited and unbiased, and you can have it for your enemy, in quotes. And so let's call this universal compassion. So I'd love to know from Sharon what you think about this, because this may be a way of addressing your question, Parker, is that, we do have these two kinds of compassion. A near compassion that just, it's your partner, your closest friends, it's a limited circle. Most of us don't have more than 5 close friends. It's just too much for that near compassion. But for the broader compassion, it's probably a different way that we hold ourselves. Otherwise, we will burn out. So anyway, let me throw it over to Sharon, if that's okay. And I want to just touch some of those science points to try to address your very important question, Parker. How do we hold that? Is it near compassion or is it universal compassion that we're using? Because if we use one for the other, we may burn out.
Yeah, thank you. I always throw things over to Sharon, so that's
When in doubt, throw it to Sharon.
Oh my God. Well, it was both an incredible question and an incredible response, really. And I think both really, really beautifully put. I've been thinking so many things as you've been speaking, and part of it is that I think for some people it's clearly a question of awareness. It's not recognizing ourselves in someone else. So there really is a kind of almost vacuous sense of the other. It's just an abstraction. And it is extremely painful to stop and realize that's like a child that is undergoing that. That could be my child, or, not in the sense that you're saying of absorbing it and identifying and burning out, but just to even feel that kind of piercing pain is difficult. But I think part of what makes it more difficult is we feel we're alone, rather than in the context of some community, recognizing how difficult things are. I think the sense of feeling helpless is one of the most corrosive things we can feel, and it is really unbearable for us. We will do anything to not feel that, and yet we're also not capable of fixing it all. That's sort of not the point of bearing witness, because if we flip into that, then we will burn out for sure.
Right.
We have to be present. We have to be open to the ability, to the degree that we can be in love, in a loving sense. And then there are probably boundaries. There are probably limits.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to this conversation, which is that for me, when I reach some of those limit points, it's important for me to become aware that when I open myself to the whole, I'm not only opening to all the suffering that's out there, I'm opening to all the gifts that are out there. I'm opening to the variety, the texture, the color, the energy, the life that saves me from the boredom of just hanging out with people like me all the time, which is really very boring. And I'm in these days and times, I'm opening myself to vast resources of resilience and tenacity in the face of suffering that's larger than anything I can actually imagine, given who I am and the world in which I live. So there's a lot out there. And as part of, I think, discerning my own capacity for compassion, what kind of compassion, and my desire to stay actively engaged so that I don't engage in self-imposed helplessness, which I think is a thing that goes around. As part of that, I like to remind myself that I can tap into resources that help me keep going in my quest to be connected and in my desire to be useful.
Yeah. Well, if I can build on that, Parker, and really build on to Sharon, what you're saying, you know, that resilience that you're talking about, that resource to tap into, you know, for me, and I hope this doesn't sound too weird as a science person, but, you know, this simple practice, this wheel of awareness practice, that is, the idea is, how do you integrate consciousness? It allows you to get to the hub of the wheel, which is the knowing of consciousness, versus the rim, which are the knowns. And so for me, you know, when I'm reading the paper, seeing all the suffering going on in the world, as you mentioned earlier, Parker, how do we hold that universal compassion without burning out, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama would say? You know, for me, the resource that's within this body's capacity to tap into is the hub. And there's a whole kind of science that I don't need to get into here, but in a way, suffering is a chaos and rigidity that emerges from impaired integration. And the portal through which integration arises is through what we call the plane of possibility, that is the hub. The hub is a metaphor, but there's a deep mechanism there. And so if I'm experiencing with a patient I'm working with, or a family I'm working with, or reading the paper and feeling the suffering, it's always a rim aspect of impaired integration. And so the invitation of integrity, which is related to integration, of bringing a responsibility to care for the world in this universal compassionate way, would be for this body to tap into the resource of the hub, and then the connection, open awareness, and love that are tapped into there, I don't have to create. And they are the portal through which integration arises. So any suffering I encounter close up or more universally will be met from this cold state of the hub. And so as the body walks around, this body walks around to do whatever of service ways I can be of service, I need to, in a sense, take care of my own oxygen, you know, with the oxygen mask, by going to that place of the hub. Any kind of suffering that I might pick up as kind of like an antenna that then resonates with it will bring me up to the rim of my wheel, if you will, right, to these plateaus and peaks we talk about. And then I'm resonating with the chaos and rigidity that is the suffering. It hurts. It feels terrible. And I then can drop back into the hub where the connection, open awareness, and love are there. I don't make them there, but I tap into that. So I bring that cold state, connection, open awareness, and love, toward the rim with its suffering of chaos and rigidity sometimes. But other times you can have, you know, incredible gifts and joy and the sunset and walking along the beach, or watching, you know, I was hiking the other day, I saw a California newt crawling his way up a hill from the creek. And then the colonialist in me said, oh, newts are supposed to be in the creek. I should lift him up and put him back in the creek. And then I went down into the hub, fortunately, and I said, you colonialist, you let that newt do whatever that newt thinks the newt wants to do. If he's going to climb dozens of feet away from the creek, this newt knows what he's doing. Keep your hands to your side and just watch him, which I did for a long time. And I don't know where he ended up, but I could watch the rim impulse to say, I know better, newts should be in the creek. And I could let nature happen. It's the same with the suffering. Is, you know, we want to try to bring people to integrative states of harmony out of the chaos and rigidity that come from impaired integration. But we can only do that with connection, open awareness, and love, right? With tapping into that and realizing we can't control everything. We can't save the world. We can be of service to the world by coming from this integrated place of love.
And thank you, Sharon, Parker. And maybe we could go to questions just to build in a little bit of this towards as we come to the close of our session today. Just for everyone to know, we'll be capturing the questions that are in the chat, and we'll be coming back to everyone on those. with responses from our wonderful trio. And these will also be questions that we can go into deeper in the cafe style session that happens later on this month. I'd love to put a question to the group, and in a way, Sharon, I'd love to almost in a way first start by targeting this at you, if that works, but to everyone else, because you've talked about both, the both actually earlier in the call, and it's about paying attention and having compassion outwards as well as inwards. And so we've talked about how, with the question that Parker shared, how we can be more compassionate towards everything around us. And how can we cultivate that kind of compassion also more towards ourselves, especially perhaps to those parts of ourselves that then engage with that outer world?
Well, I think actually it's like ultimately it's like a transparency. It's like maybe our tendency, our conditioning is more to care for others, but maybe we have to learn how to receive as well as give, so that the flow is unimpeded. It's not like a wall that's saying this can only move in one direction. And it could be the other way around. Maybe we only care about ourselves. We don't care at all about anybody else, and so I think a lot about that transparency of giving and receiving. And I think in a way, the inner work that we might choose to do is it's like a fractal. It's a representative of all the outer work we do as well. And that I think is largely about relationship. I know you and I and some people, listening have had this conversation before when talking about like what to do if you have a very severe kind of nasty inner critic. And it would be emblematic of how are we with adversity? How are we with difficulty? How are we internal or external? And so as you know, one of the suggestions we sometimes make is if you have like this really nasty voice that is repetitive and kind of grueling, give it a name, give it a wardrobe, give it a personality, so that what you come to is the understanding that it's all about relationship, not dismissing and not trying to annihilate, and also not exalting and holding it as this is the only true message I ever receive. And so, as I've said, with apologies to anyone listening named Lucy, I named my own inner critic Lucy based on the character in the Peanuts comic strip, because I once saw a cartoon where Lucy, the character Lucy, is talking to Charlie Brown, and she says, Charlie Brown, what your problem is? The problem with you is that you're you. Like basically you're worth nothing. And poor Charlie Brown says, well, what in the world can I do about that? And Lucy responds by saying, well, I don't pretend to be able to give advice. I merely point out the problem. And somehow this was on a desk that was, the cartoon was left in a room that I had moved into for a month. And somehow whenever I was walking by that desk, my eye would fall right on that line. The problem with you is that you're you. Like if you really knew who you were, it would be a really sad story, because that Lucy voice had been so dominant in my earlier life. And yet with, all my years actually of practice at that point, I had some tools, and that's all about relationship. So it actually happened right after I saw the cartoon where something great happened for me. And my very first thought was, it's never going to happen again. And I greeted that thought with, hi, Lucy. And my favorite form of that was chill out, Lucy, just chill, which is different than you're right, Lucy. You're always right. This is the only real thing about me, that I'm worthless. And it's also different than being ashamed of what is coming up and feeling this is wrong. And I've been meditating for years now. Why is Lucy still here? This is a disgrace. And, it's, we sometimes call mindfulness like the place in the middle where we can open fully to everything that is happening in recognition and with a kind of loving awareness, so that there's even a tenderness like, chill, Lucy, have a cup of tea. Just, you sit there quietly. That's all right. Or if you need to keep talking, you can keep talking. But it's knowing that our capacity for caring about ourselves and our capacity for awareness is stronger than any part or aspect that is appearing in a kind of damaging way.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I have to say, Sharon, that as a writer, I'm used to critics, right? External critics. And so to my inner critic, I say the same thing I say to the external critics: go write your own book. And, and when you've done that, come back and we'll talk. So there are different ways to skin a cat.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
I'm going to use that, Parker, having just finished a very challenging manuscript. I'm going to use that.
Right.
Thank you.
It's handy.
Yeah.
And Sharon, just as we close up here, as with Parker and with Dan, I wonder if there are other examples of these kinds of aspects of self or personalities that people might be able to recognize and then come into a relationship with.
Yeah, I mean, when I said, much earlier that these are kind of like stories or narratives, but they have like a physical or biological component. I also think of a friend of mine who describes herself, I think, quite accurately as the kind of person who can never say no pretty well. Like she's asked to do something at work, which is way over the top, but she's afraid, that she has to do it, or no one will like her, and she'll be like a failure, seen as a failure. And so what she did once in her meditation was she sat down and she purposely brought up that kind of scenario where she would likely, say yes too much and get overwhelmed. And she learned it in her body, like this panic that was very visceral that would come over her that actually appeared before the thought, oh, they're not going to like you. It was just this wave that came over her, and that became her feedback system for when she was, say, at work again, and people would ask her that very kind of question and she'd feel that thing. That was her signal to say, I'll have to get back to you later. She couldn't quite bring herself to say no, but she could say, I need some space, basically. And then she could say no from a greater distance. And so in a way, I think that is partly what integration means. It's like being able to hold whatever we're feeling, maybe extract the information from it without kind of going down that pit of identification, this is a terrible thing to feel. I shouldn't feel this, or this is so correct, like I must always fulfill everybody's needs all day long, whatever it might be.
And I'll just say to you, Dan, that ever since I heard the horse story in your life, I've thought about the metaphor in my own life, which has to do with the number of times I've been thrown off my high horse. Because, maybe this is a male thing, I don't know, or maybe it's just a me thing. I'm the only person in the universe who's ever done this, but I do get on a high horse every now and then about the righteousness of my cause, or how it is that I'm the only one who can solve this problem or help in this situation. And the experience of being thrown off those high horses has been very educative for me, very salutary, because it's a constant lesson in the fact that, as I learned in the high desert, the cosmos is simultaneously indifferent to me and accepting and forgiving of me. And that somehow there's a balance there. There's an integration in that language itself that allows me to carry on without pumping up my sense of importance. And because when I pump up my sense of importance, that's when failure becomes personal devastation, or a sense of, totally lapsed responsibility. All kinds of bad things happen. I get angry at all the bad people who haven't collaborated in me getting the outcome I desired. And so, I don't know, the horse has become an important image for my spiritual life. And I often think about, the tradition in which I was raised. Saul of Tarsus was knocked off his horse, at least as portrayed by the Italian painter Caravaggio, and had his enlightenment experience that made him Paul. Not that that's terribly enlightened, but that's the story.
Mm.
So there's that.
So we're coming to the close of our time together. And so, Dan, I'm going to pass it back to Sharon and Parker to close us up with any closing thoughts that they have on the session that we've done today. And then Luzette and I will just come in to close things up after that. So Parker, Sharon, super glad to pass it to you for our closing thoughts today.
Mhm.
Well, I want to thank you again, Dan, for this really enlightening hour and a half together. Left me with a lot of thoughts worth thinking, and I will continue to do so. I just want to say how important it is for me to understand the connection between the personal story, your personal story of being almost 20, and the thoughts and what you've been tracking ever since then in your own experience in working with others therapeutically and in science. It's a good example, I think, of kind of holding together and a deep bow to the self that is you, but also seeing how it's connected to a much larger body of work, which has influenced many people. So thank you. Thank you for being you and for being not you.
Thank you, Parker. Thank you. That's funny and beautiful.
What's the way of saying "we"? But you're talking about you. Is there a you?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, right? Me and we, and yeah, I guess there's be you, I guess.
You. It's me and you, right? You.
Yeah.
Just in case you need another chapter in your book, which sounds like you might have finished. I really want to thank you as well for the whole body of your work, as well as I'm always grateful to be with Parker and all of these amazing people. And I'm very grateful to be with you in this exploration and, ranging from the assumptions we hold without realizing we hold them about who we are, which are really important to unpack just so that we're living in reality, to expanding our vision beyond maybe what we've held as cherished beliefs, but are really distortions of some kind. And there's so many that any society, any culture may be proffering, as their standards of truth, and to have the courage. And I think, again, a lot of it comes down to community, to not feel you're struggling alone, to try to see through some of these things, but that it is best a kind of collective effort where we can support one another.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Well, it's an honor to be here with everyone. And thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Parker, for sharing yourselves with all of us. And I'm really, really grateful to be here with all of you. And thank you all for all the work you do in our waiting world. Really,
thank you.
So powerful.
So maybe moi would be the farewell kiss.
So we just have a few quick announcements as well, just as we come to a close. One is that later this week, as part of the Skull Forum Week, we are hosting a session that is being done with Gerald Worth, who's the head of the Vienna Boys Choir, and Bishop Chantal Wright and her gospel choir. And this will be exploring music and well-being and singing. And so I think one of our wonderful team members is actually going to put the link into the chat, and we'll probably send that out as well as part of this. But we'd love to have you join, and it should be quite remarkable. We will also be hosting another of our cafes. One of the requests that we gotten as this series started off was creating a space for people to reflect together on what was shared in these sessions. So in 2 weeks on Tuesday, and this will be every fourth week of the month, our wonderful and extraordinary dean of our Inner Works program at the Wellbeing Project will be hosting a group that want to join to reflect further on this and to be in conversation about everything that we've heard on today's call. And that information will be shared out as well by email for those that are on the list. And we'd love to have you join. We had our first session last month and it went beautifully. And then the last is just a preview of our next session in May. So it's to say that our session is going to focus on trauma and understanding and addressing trauma. And we will be joined by two wonderful speakers. As part of that, we'll be joined by Gabor Mate and also by Kim Rosen. And we're really excited about that session as well. So just a few different things for those of you that have been part of this series from the beginning and would like to join in for more. So Lizette, maybe I could pass it over to you to close this out. And Dan, again, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Parker. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful session together. Almost undescribable with words, but with lots of compassion and love for everyone. Let's close out by unmuting our microphones and saying bye in our own languages. 1, 2, 3. Adiós. Nos vemos.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Merci. Bedankt gedaan. That's a good one.
Keep well, all. Keep safe and well. Bye-bye.